The smell of smoke and sizzling meat hung in the air. Children laughed, music played softly, and a family gathered around a grill in a public park. A moment of peace, a Sunday ritual of togetherness. But then, the sound of tires crunching against gravel interrupted the warmth. 2 police cruisers pulled up, doors opening with that sharp, heavy slam that turns heads and stills laughter. Officers stepped out, scanning the scene as if they had stumbled upon a crime in progress. Their eyes did not see joy. They did not see community. They saw suspicion, framed by a lens that has shadowed black families for generations. One officer gestured toward the grill. "Permit?" he asked flatly, voice clipped as though the right to breathe in that space required pre-approval. The father of the family, a tall, composed man with quiet strength in his posture, calmly put down the tongs he was holding. He looked at his children, then back at the officers. Around them, silence spread. Other park-goers stared, pretending not to watch but unable to turn away. It was a scene too familiar, the intrusion of authority into a simple, human moment. Now, here is where the story sharpens. The officers thought they had walked into an ordinary enforcement. One more family they could push aside with intimidation and paperwork, but they had no idea who they were talking to. They did not yet know the history that stood before them. They did not yet recognize the name that, once spoken, would shift the balance of power in an instant. And so the question hangs here, suspended. What happens when systemic suspicion collides with quiet excellence? What unfolds when authority assumes power, only to discover they are standing before someone whose identity forces them to rethink everything? That is where this story begins. Long before the officers ever approached that barbecue pit, the father in this story had lived a life shaped by 2 forces: the quiet persistence of his community and the loud persistence of systemic suspicion. He grew up in neighborhoods where police sirens were not an exception, but a soundtrack, where every black boy was warned to keep his hands visible, his tone polite, and his movements slow. These lessons were not about respect. They were about survival. He had seen uncles pulled over for nothing more than tinted windows, cousins frisked on sidewalks for matching a description, and neighbors' celebrations shut down under the pretext of safety concerns. By the time he became a man with children of his own, the script of racial bias was one he knew too well. Yet his life had taken a different path. Unlike the officers who saw only skin color and assumption, he had carved out a career that placed him in rooms they could not imagine. His work was not just professional. It was transformational. He had studied systems of power, dismantled legal arguments, and defended those who had no defense. He understood authority not from the outside looking in, but from the inside out. And because of that, he carried a kind of calm that unsettled those who tried to provoke him. But here is the deeper root. This was not just about one father at one park. The real story lies in how society polices joy itself, how something as innocent as food on a grill becomes suspect when wrapped in black skin. Studies show that people of color are disproportionately reported for public disturbances that are nothing more than everyday living. A cookout, a gathering, a child's laughter, reclassified under the gaze of prejudice as too loud, too many, or out of place. The officers who pulled up that day were not responding to crime. They were responding to centuries of conditioning that trained them to see threat where none existed. And so the father found himself at a crossroads he had visited many times before. Ignore the disrespect and let his children internalize silence, or meet the moment with a presence that would teach them a different lesson. The officers did not know it yet, but every choice he was about to make carried weight far beyond a park bench. His response would either confirm a cycle of fear or break it open in a way that none of them, not even he, could fully predict. "Itzi," officer's tone sharpened as he repeated his question. "Do you have a permit?" His partner's hand rested on his belt, hovering near the holster in that subtle but unmistakable gesture of implied authority. Around them, the laughter of children had evaporated. The family's joy had been replaced by stillness, the kind that hangs heavy when innocence collides with intimidation. This was the fork in the road. The father could de-escalate by complying, showing papers he did not even need, and hope the officers walked away. Or he could stand tall, risk confrontation, and teach his children something greater than quiet: survival. He glanced at his wife, who held their youngest child a little closer. He saw the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and trust, silently asking him to choose carefully. The children stared, too, waiting for his cue on how to interpret this moment. Because for them, this was not just about hot dogs and hamburgers. This was about identity, about whether they belonged in that park or anywhere else in this world without apology. The father knew. His response would not only set the tone for his family, but also define the story strangers would tell once they left. Here is the psychology of such moments. Under threat, the human brain narrows its focus. Fight or flight presses in, demanding speed. Yet mastery requires pause, that sacred second when one resists the pressure to act from fear and instead chooses from principle. He understood that. Years of navigating hostile rooms had trained him to slow time when others tried to speed it up, and so he breathed deeply, long enough for the officers to notice, long enough for his children to register that their father was not rattled. She didn't know it yet, we could say of the officer with her hand near her weapon, but she was about to face a man who had spent his entire life preparing for encounters exactly like this. One decision here could cascade in either direction: humiliation or revelation, intimidation or transformation. And as the silence stretched, he chose neither submission nor provocation. He chose something else entirely. A single action was about to flip the entire outcome, but the officers could not see it coming. His father reached calmly into the side pocket of the cooler, not for papers, not for a permit, but for something else entirely. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook, the kind lawyers carry, worn at the edges but precise in its arrangement. He flipped it open with steady hands, not rushing, not posturing, simply owning the silence. Inside were documents, but not the kind the officers expected. His voice, measured and resonant, broke the tension. "I know the city code you are citing," he said, "and I know that this park requires no permit for small gatherings under 50 people. If you like, I can point you to the clause." He turned the notebook toward them, revealing a highlighted section of municipal law. The officers stiffened, caught off guard. This was not the defensive scramble they anticipated. This was not a man fumbling with excuses or bowing to intimidation. This was someone who had anticipated their move before they made it. His daughter tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Daddy knows the rules." And in that whisper lay the beginning of a reversal. But there was more. Something the officers truly had not expected. For this man was not just informed. He was the very architect of many of the policies they operated under. Years earlier, he had served as a legal strategist for the city, drafting civil rights protections that most officers skimmed past in their training manuals. He had stood in courtrooms arguing cases that shaped how authority could and could not be exercised. His was a name known in circles far above the rank of the officers now staring at him. Here is what that moment teaches us. Intelligence, when wielded quietly, unsettles arrogance more than anger ever could. The father did not raise his voice, did not challenge their authority with hostility. Instead, he revealed a different kind of power, one rooted in preparation, in knowledge, in an unshakable command of truth. And though the officers tried to maintain composure, the cracks showed. They exchanged quick glances, the kind that admit uncertainty without words. Still, power does not yield easily. They were not ready to back down. And so, rather than admit their error, one officer chose a different tactic. escalation disguised as procedure. She pulled out her radio, murmuring for supervisor backup. A crowd began to gather now, sensing the shift, drawn to the silent duel unfolding in the park. And with that call, the story moved toward its breaking point. The call for a supervisor echoed through the static of the radio, and with it came a shift in atmosphere. What began as a family gathering was now transforming into a spectacle. Neighbors walked closer, phones in hand, recording. Some whispered, others stared in tense silence. The father's children clung tighter to their mother, sensing that something larger than barbecue rights was unfolding. And, in truth, it was. This was the part of the story where power, threatened by exposure, doubled down rather than retreated. When the supervisor arrived, his demeanor carried the weight of authority sharpened by arrogance. He looked not at the family but at his officers, as if their word alone defined reality. "What's the problem here?" he asked, tone clipped, eyes narrowing on the father. Before the father could respond, the first officer spoke quickly, framing the situation. Unauthorized gathering, refused to comply. It was a familiar tactic. Rewrite the narrative before truth has a chance to breathe. The father stood, still, letting the words hang, knowing that silence can sometimes reveal more than speech. Here lies the systemic obstacle. Institutions are built not only on policies but on patterns of protection. When officers bend rules, supervisors often bend with them, shielding error under the guise of protocol. In this moment, the father could see the machinery at work. The supervisor glanced at the notebook, uninterested in the highlighted statutes, uninterested in law itself. His interest was authority, and authority demands submission. "Pack it up," he ordered flatly, "or we'll cite you for noncompliance." The crowd murmured, phones recording now with steady hands. The father's wife whispered, "Maybe we should just go," her voice cracking with the weight of both, fear and exhaustion. For her, the calculus was simple. Protect the children, avoid escalation. For him, the calculus cut deeper. Comply now, and the children learn that even when you are right, you must bow. Resist, and they may watch you taken, away in cuffs. The weight of both choices pressed heavy on his chest. And here came the breaking point. His son, barely 10 years old, asked aloud the question that shattered the fragile calm. "Daddy, why don't they want us here?" It was not a question for legal codes or city ordinances. It was a question of belonging, of worth, of identity. The crowd grew quieter still, waiting for the father's response, waiting to see whether this moment would end in defeat or defiance. For the first time, he felt the sting of doubt. Could he protect them without surrendering? Could he stand tall without being broken? The humiliation was sharp. His children's innocence had been punctured, their joy swallowed by suspicion. And for a heartbeat, even he wondered if the system was too heavy to fight in the middle of a public park surrounded by cameras, pressed between dignity and danger. The scene was bending toward collapse. But collapse, sometimes, is where transformation begins. The silence after his son's question lingered like smoke in the air. The father looked down at his boy, then at the circle of faces around him, some hostile, some curious, some quietly hopeful. In that moment, he understood that this confrontation was no longer about ordinances or permits. It was about narrative. Who gets to define this family? Who gets to define this space? And, most importantly, what lesson will his children carry forward from this day? That realization was the spark. He closed his notebook with deliberate calm, slid it back into the cooler, and lifted his head. His voice carried not the edge of anger, but the weight of history. "Sir," he said to the supervisor, "you're free to write that citation, but when you do, please make sure it's clear that you cited a former constitutional law professor, the man who helped write half the ordinances you're trying to enforce. And when that report reaches the city council, which it will, You will have to explain why your officers disrupted a lawful family gathering in violation of the very policies you swore to uphold." His words landed with quiet force, not shouted, not rushed, but undeniable. The crowd stirred. Some gasped, others exchanged knowing glances. The officers blinked, caught between disbelief and unease. Until now, they thought they held the pen. That wrote the script of this moment. But suddenly, it was clear. The father had picked up the pen himself. He had shifted the frame. He was no longer the accused. He was the mirror reflecting their misconduct back at them. Here is what that moment teaches us. Transformation often begins not with force, but with reframing. When systems try to strip you of dignity, one of the most radical moves is to reclaim the narrative, to show that your presence is not the problem, but their perception is. And for the first time that day, the supervisor hesitated. His eyes flickered to the crowd, to the phones still recording, to the officers waiting for direction. He knew that a single wrong move here could echo far beyond this park. The father bent down, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We belong here," he said softly, words meant for his family but audible enough for everyone. "Never let anyone tell you different." It was not defiance for the sake of pride. It was instruction, etched into the moment, turning humiliation into legacy. The stage was now set. The plan was clear. He would not fight their hostility with hostility. He would fight it with presence, truth, and the kind of authority they could not strip away. The officers did not know it yet, but the tide had already turned. The man they tried to shrink had just expanded, not in volume, but in gravity. And gravity, once it shifts, pulls everything with it. The park was still. Every eye was on the father, every phone camera raised. But he did not rush, did not grandstand, did not let adrenaline dictate his next move. Instead, he began his climb, not a loud one, but a silent, strategic ascent. He took a step forward, just enough to shift the geometry of the scene. The officers now had to look up to meet his gaze. Without hostility, without threat, he forced them into a posture of acknowledgement. "Let's be clear," he said, tone calm as steel. "You have no legal ground to demand we leave, and I will not uproot my children for the sake of your comfort. What I will do, however, is ensure this moment is remembered exactly as it happened, without distortion." He gestured subtly toward the circle of neighbors recording. The crowd, sensing his signal, adjusted. Phones steadier, angles clearer, a silent alliance forming around him. He had transformed witnesses into archivists. No longer was this a private humiliation, it was public record. And in that shift lay his first quiet victory. The officers had wanted the family isolated, cornered. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by an audience, every movement preserved in pixels that could not be erased. Here is what that moment teaches us. True power often builds in silence. The most effective strategy is not always a dramatic clash, but the quiet repositioning of the battlefield. By refusing to move, by refusing to yield his dignity, he made them move instead, into the role of performers under unwanted spotlight. It was subtle, but undeniable. The control was slipping. Still, the officers pressed on, unwilling to yield ground. The supervisor muttered into his radio, perhaps hoping for reinforcements, perhaps stalling for time. But the father remained steady, his presence sharpening with each second. He did not shout, did not plead. He simply existed with a gravity that made every attempt to diminish him feel smaller, pettier, less defensible. The more they tried to assert dominance, the more the crowd saw the imbalance, the absurdity. The climb was not loud. It was not finished. But it was underway, and as he stood with his family close, with his community encircling him, a truth was dawning. The officers were no longer in control of this story. The man they tried to corner had rewritten the script, and they were now actors in a play. They did not author. The silence before the reversal had stretched long enough. The stage was ready for what came next, the public unraveling of power. The supervisor cleared his throat, his authority now strained under the weight of the crowd's eyes and the quiet firmness of the father's stance. He attempted to reclaim the script. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time." But before he could finish, a voice rose from the crowd. "He's right, I looked it up." A woman held up her phone, screen glowing with the same ordinance the father had cited minutes earlier. Others chimed in, murmurs of agreement, snippets of confirmation. The officers were no longer in control of the narrative. The truth had slipped out of their hands and into the mouths of bystanders. The father didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply stood as the momentum shifted. The supervisor's words faltered, his authority unraveling not through confrontation, but exposure. And then came the moment that sealed it. A man in a city council badge approached from the edge of the crowd. He had been at the park for another event, but word of the confrontation had drawn him near. When he saw the father, recognition lit across his face. He stepped forward, extended a hand, and addressed him by name. Not just any name, but a name tied to courtrooms, policies, and victories that had reshaped civil rights in the city. The air changed instantly. The officers stiffened, suddenly, aware of who they were standing against. The crowd's murmurs swelled into open judgment. This was no longer a dispute over barbecue. This was an exposure of systemic arrogance in broad daylight. The councilman's voice carried above the hush. "This man has done more for the legal structure of this city than any of you standing here. If he says this gathering is lawful, I believe him, and so will the council." It was the climax, but it was not loud. It was quiet devastation, the kind where the aggressors realize the battle is lost, not because their opponent shouted them down, but because their own assumptions have been dismantled in public view. The father had not only defended his family's right to joy, he had forced the system to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was unflattering. Here is what that moment teaches us. Victory is not always about crushing opposition. Sometimes it is about letting their own weight pull them down. The officers had arrived with swagger and suspicion. They now stood diminished, caught in the gravity of a man they had underestimated. The park, once filled with tension, now brimmed with something else, vindication. But climaxes are never the end. There is always fallout, ripples that extend beyond the moment itself. And as the crowd dispersed and the grills smoked on, the question lingered. What happens after a system is publicly unmasked? When the councilman's words settled, the confrontation dissolved not with handcuffs, but with silence. The officers, their authority pierced, exchanged brief, embarrassed glances before retreating to their cruisers. They left not because they wanted to, but because staying would only deepen the wound already carved into their credibility. Their departure was no victory march. It was a quiet retreat, watched by dozens of witnesses who had recorded every second. And in those recordings, the story had already escaped the park. It would travel to social media, to local newsrooms, to dinner table conversations. A story not of resistance crushed, but of dignity defended. For the father's family, relief was immediate but layered with something deeper. His children looked at him differently now, not just as the man who grilled burgers or tucked them into bed, but as someone who could stand unshaken when the world tried to shrink him. His wife, still holding their youngest, felt the trembling, in her chest, ease. What had threatened to be a scar on their memory had instead become a lesson etched in strength. And for the father himself, there was a quiet ache beneath the victory, because he knew that this moment, triumphant as it seemed, was only one battle in a much longer war. The officers, too, would feel the consequences. The supervisor would later face a review after the video surfaced, his conduct scrutinized under the same policies he ignored in the park. The younger officers, though, carried a different kind of fallout. They had been humbled, publicly, by a man they had underestimated. For some, it would calcify into bitterness, but for others, it would plant a seed, a realization that the uniform does not make one untouchable, that authority collapses without truth to hold it up, and the community. They carried the image of that day like a lantern. Parents whispered to their children that they had witnessed a man stand firm without breaking. Teenagers replayed the footage, studying the cadence of his words, the stillness of his presence, learning that strength could be steady, not loud. The park itself, once threatened with tension, became a symbol, proof that joy could be defended, that suspicion could be overturned. Here is what that moment teaches us: when injustice is exposed. In public, it does not vanish immediately, but it weakens. It leaves cracks in the armor of silence. The father had not just protected his family's cookout, he had reshaped the air around them, showing that dignity, when held firm, ripples outward, and those ripples into phones, into policy discussions, into young minds, can outlast the moment itself. But the story does not end with fallout. It ends with legacy. And legacy asks a harder question: how will we respond when we face our own version of that confrontation? The smoke of the grill eventually faded. The children returned to play, and the park exhaled the tension it had been holding. But the memory of that day lingered, not as a confrontation, but as a parable. A father, once cornered by suspicion, had turned intimidation into instruction. He had shown his children, and everyone watching, that dignity is not something granted by authority. It is something lived, owned, and defended, even in the face of systemic pressure. That is his legacy. The lesson is larger than one family. Every day, somewhere, someone faces a version of that barbecue moment, a test of belonging, a confrontation with bias, an attempt to shrink joy into compliance. Sometimes it is at work, sometimes at school, sometimes in the quiet corners of daily life. And in those moments we each face the same fork in the road the father faced: shrink or stand, comply in silence or reclaim the narrative. His story reminds us that the quiet strength of presence, knowledge, and composure can turn even the heaviest systems on their heads. Here is what that moment teaches us. Transformation is rarely about volume. It is about gravity. When you root yourself in truth, you shift the weight of the room. People may resist, systems may push back, but presence carries farther than panic. That is not just survival. That is strategy. And it is a strategy every one of us must learn if we are to pass on something stronger to those who come after us. So, what will you do when your version of the barbecue comes? When you are tested in the small, ordinary spaces of life, a meeting, a classroom, a street corner, will you shrink under suspicion, or will you hold your ground with the same quiet force? The father's children walked away that day with more than food in their stomachs. They walked away with a living example that joy is worth protecting, that dignity is worth standing for, that silence can be broken by presence alone. If this story resonated with your values, let it travel farther. Share it. Speak about it. Let it shape the way you move through your own battles. Because legacies are not built by moments we avoid. They are built by moments we stand in fully. And if this story carried something important for you, then like, comment, and subscribe, not just to honor the narrative, but to become part of a community that believes dignity, justice, and presence are worth defending. The officers, once so certain in their authority, retreated with stiff shoulders and hollow apologies. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering about what they had just witnessed. The family, still gathered around the grill, did not return immediately to their laughter. There was relief, yes, but also the sting of knowing how quickly joy could be threatened. Yet, in that same moment, there was also pride, the quiet pride, of seeing dignity stand unshaken. The father looked at his children, at the friends who had remained by their side, and he knew this day would live in their memory not as a day of defeat, but as proof that truth can disarm even the most rigid assumptions. Later that night, as the coals cooled and the park emptied, one of the younger children asked softly, "Why did they come for us?" The father knelt down, his voice steady, calm, and certain. "Because sometimes the world forgets who we are, but today they were reminded." Those words hung like a promise, carried on the night air, a vow that no matter how many times suspicion tried to strip them of belonging, they would continue to stand, to cook, to laugh, and to claim joy as their right. And this is the lesson that lingers for us. Injustice does not always appear as chains or bars. Sometimes it comes as an interruption, a questioning of one's right to simply exist in peace. But when dignity stands firm, when community refuses to shrink back, those interruptions can be transformed into revelations. The officers left the park that day carrying a truth they could not unsee, and those who watched learned something, too, that authority without wisdom crumbles in the face of integrity, and that excellence, lived quietly yet powerfully, is its own form of resistance.